May 9, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed. And in a requisitioned German military barracks outside of Munich, a formal surrender ceremony was about to take place that would become one of the most explosive confrontations of the entire occupation. 53 high-ranking Wehrmacht officers stood in formation, their uniforms still pristine despite the devastation around them, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes fixed straight ahead. They had been ordered to present themselves to formally surrender their command to American forces, to sign documents acknowledging Allied authority, and to participate in a flag ceremony that would symbolize the transfer of power. It was supposed to be routine, symbolic, civilized, the kind of ceremony that would be photographed for newspapers back home, showing defeated German officers acknowledging American victory with proper military decorum. But what happened instead would reveal a poisonous defiance still festering in the hearts of Germany's military elite. And it would trigger a response from General George S. Patton so devastating, so psychologically brutal, that it would be whispered about in military circles for generations. The American flag was raised on a pole in the center of the barracks courtyard, the stars and stripes climbing slowly against a gray German sky. American soldiers stood at attention, saluting their flag. Allied officers from various nations watched with formal respect. And then came the moment that changed everything. As the American national anthem began to play. As protocol and military tradition demanded that all officers present render a salute to the flag of the occupying power. 41 of those 53 Wehrmacht officers instead snapped their arms out in the stiff-armed Nazi salute. Their heels clicking together. Their voices rising in unison. Sieg Heil, Heil Hitler. The sound echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. The American anthem was still playing. The flag was still rising. And these German officers, these men who had just surrendered, who were now prisoners, who had just seen their entire nation crushed into rubble, were saluting a dead dictator instead of acknowledging the authority of their conquerors. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. The American soldiers standing in formation couldn't believe what they were seeing. The junior American officers looked to their superiors, unsure whether this was some kind of provocation, some attempt to start a final suicidal confrontation. And standing at the reviewing platform, General George S. Patton, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables, his hands gripping the railing in front of him with such force that his knuckles turned white, watched with eyes that had gone from ice blue to something darker, something absolutely murderous. One of Patton's aides later recalled that he had never seen the general so still, so utterly controlled in his rage. Patton didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply stood there as the American anthem finished playing, as the flag reached the top of the pole, as those 41 Wehrmacht officers lowered their arms from their Nazi salute and returned to attention as if nothing unusual had happened. The 12 German officers who had properly saluted the American flag stood among their defiant comrades, looking uncomfortable, perhaps ashamed, certainly aware that something catastrophic was about to unfold. The senior Wehrmacht officer present, a general named Klaus von Rothenburg, stepped forward to sign the surrender documents. He was a career military man, 58 years old, from an old Prussian military family that had served Germany for generations. He carried himself with that aristocratic bearing that characterized the Wehrmacht's old guard, men who viewed themselves as professional soldiers, not Nazis, men who claimed they had simply been serving their country, following orders, doing their duty. Von Rothenburg approached the table where the documents waited, reached for the pen, and that's when Patton finally moved. Stop. One word, spoken quietly but with such absolute authority that von Rothenburg's hand froze in midair. Patton descended from the reviewing platform and walked across the courtyard. His boots struck the pavement with measured, deliberate steps. Every eye was on him. The assembled Wehrmacht officers watched him approach, and some of them, the smarter ones, the ones who knew Patton's reputation, began to realize they had made a terrible mistake. Patton stopped 3 feet from von Rothenburg and looked at him with an expression of such contempt that the German general actually took a step backward. "General von Rothenburg," Patton said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "did I just witness 41 officers under your command render a Nazi salute to a dead dictator instead of saluting the flag of the United States Army?" Von Rothenburg drew himself up, trying to maintain his dignity. "General Patton, these men are soldiers of Germany. We have surrendered our weapons and our territory, but we have not surrendered our honor or our right to." He didn't get to finish. "Your Honor," Patton's voice rose now, sharp as a whip crack. "You stand there and talk to me about honor? You, who served a regime that murdered 6 million Jews. You, whose armies burned villages and executed prisoners. You, who followed a madman into a war that destroyed your own country. You dare speak to me about honor?" Von Rothenburg's face flushed red. "We are professional soldiers. We serve Germany, not. You served Hitler." Patton shouted now, and the assembled Germans actually flinched. "Every one of you swore a personal oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Not to Germany. Not to the German people. To Hitler himself. And just now, with your Frere dead in a bunker and your country in ruins, you had one simple task: salute the American flag as a gesture of surrender. And instead, 41 of you chose to salute the corpse of the monster who destroyed everything you claim to love. So don't you dare stand there and talk to me about honor." The courtyard was absolutely silent. Von Rothenburg opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say. And that's when Patton did something that nobody expected. Something that would be debated by military historians and ethicists for decades to come. He turned to his aide and gave an order that made every American officer present exchange shocked glances. "Remove these officers' uniforms. All of them. Right now. Strip them down to their undergarments in this courtyard, and then we're going to have a conversation about what honor actually means. Before we go any further, we need you to pause right here and tell us something. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching this from. Are you in the United States? Germany? Somewhere else? Entirely? Because this story, this moment of raw confrontation between victor and defeated, this clash over what military honor means in the face of atrocity, this is the kind of historical truth that doesn't make it into most textbooks. This is the messy, dramatic, morally complex reality of World War II's aftermath. If you want more stories like this, authentic accounts that show you the real human drama behind the history, then hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button if you're already gripped by what you're hearing. And here's what we really want to know. Do you think Patton went too far with what he did next? Or was this exactly the response that Nazi defiance deserved? Drop your honest opinion in the comments, because this story is about to get even more intense. The question isn't just what Patton did, it's why he did it, and what it revealed about the psychology of defeated men who still couldn't let go of the ideology that had destroyed them. Now let's get back to that courtyard and see what happened when Patton ordered those Wehrmacht officers stripped of their uniforms. The American MPs moved forward hesitantly, uncertain if they had heard the order correctly. Strip German officers of their uniforms? In public? This wasn't standard protocol. This wasn't in any manual. One young captain approached Patton and spoke in a low voice. "Sir, the Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners." Patton cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "Captain, the Geneva Convention requires that we treat military personnel with respect when they behave as military personnel. These men just rendered a Nazi salute to a dead dictator while standing on American-occupied soil during an American flag ceremony. They have demonstrated that they do not recognize legitimate military authority, which means they are not acting as professional soldiers. They are acting as political fanatics. And fanatics don't get to hide behind uniforms and military courtesy." He turned back to von Rothenburg. "You have two choices, General. Your officers can remove their uniforms voluntarily and we can proceed with this discussion in a civilized manner, or my MPs will remove those uniforms by force, which will be considerably less dignified. You have 30 seconds to decide. The color drained from von Rothenburg's face. Around him, the 41 officers who had given the Nazi salute stood frozen, realizing the trap they had walked into. A Wehrmacht officer's uniform wasn't just clothing. It was identity, status, the physical manifestation of everything they believed themselves to be. The elaborate insignia, the medals, the perfect tailoring, all of it reinforced the image of the professional soldier, the honorable warrior, the military elite. To be stripped of that uniform was to be stripped of that identity, to be reduced from officer to ordinary man, to have the costume of authority removed and reveal what lay beneath. Von Rothenburg looked at his officers, saw the growing panic in their eyes, and made his decision. "We will comply under protest," he said stiffly. "Let the record show that this is a violation of—" "The record will show," Patton interrupted, "that you and your officers committed an act of political defiance during a formal military ceremony, and that you are being disciplined accordingly. Now strip, or be stripped. Those are your options." What followed was one of the most humiliating scenes of the German surrender. Slowly, with trembling hands, the 41 officers who had saluted Hitler began removing their uniforms. The elaborate jackets with their medals and insignia came off first, folded with shaking hands or dropped carelessly on the ground depending on each man's level of shock and rage. Then the shirts, the boots, the trousers, until 41 German officers stood in the courtyard in their undershirts and shorts, their feet bare on the cold pavement, their carefully maintained military bearing collapsing as they were reduced to looking like elderly men at a medical examination. Some of them were crying quietly. Others stared straight ahead, their faces burning with shame. A few looked at Patton with pure hatred, and Patton let the moment stretch out, let them stand there in their vulnerability and humiliation for a full minute before he spoke again. The 12 officers who had properly saluted the American flag remained in full uniform, standing separate from their disgraced comrades, and the contrast was stark and deliberate, a visual lesson in the consequences of defiance versus cooperation. "Gentlemen," Patton began, his voice calm now, almost conversational, "let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I don't see soldiers. I don't see warriors. I see middle-aged and old men who are cold and embarrassed and wishing desperately that they had made a different choice 5 minutes ago." He began to pace in front of them, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know what's interesting about that Nazi salute you gave? It wasn't brave. It wasn't honorable. It was the easiest thing in the world. A reflex, a habit, a comfortable old gesture that let you pretend for just a few more seconds that you hadn't really lost, that you were still the man you were a year ago. It was the ultimate act of cowardice, actually, because saluting that American flag would have required you to face reality, to acknowledge that everything you believed in and fought for has been utterly destroyed. And you weren't brave enough to do that." Von Rothenburg, standing in his undershirt with his thin legs exposed, tried to maintain some dignity. "We are German officers. We swore an oath. You swore an oath to a madman." Patton shot back. "And you kept that oath while that madman led your country into complete destruction. You kept that oath while cities burned and children starved. You kept that oath while concentration camps operated on German soil. And now, even with Hitler dead and Germany divided among the Allies, you're still keeping that oath because it's easier than admitting you were catastrophically, horrifically wrong." He stopped pacing and faced them directly. "Here's what's going to happen now. You're going to stand here, in your underwear, while I explain to you exactly what your oath to Hitler accomplished. And then you're going to make a real choice. Probably the first genuinely free choice you've made in years." Patton signaled to one of his aides, who brought forward a stack of photographs. These were images that had been taken during the liberation of concentration camps. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Photographs of skeletal corpses piled like cordwood. Photographs of gas chambers and crematoriums. photographs of survivors who looked more like ghosts than human beings. Patton ordered these photographs passed among the half-naked officers, and he watched their faces as they looked at images that most of them claimed they had never seen before, atrocities they insisted they had known nothing about. "This," Patton said, his voice hard as iron, "this is what you saluted. This is what your precious oath to Hitler created. While you were clicking your heels and saying Sieg Heil, this is what was happening in your own country, often within miles of where you were stationed." Some of the officers looked at the photographs and their faces went pale. Others refused to look, turning their heads away, and Patton's MPs physically turned them back, forcing them to witness. "You don't get to look away," Patton commanded. "You don't get to claim ignorance. You are German officers. You had intelligence networks, communication systems, eyes and ears throughout this country. If you didn't know about this, it's because you chose not to know. It's because knowing would have required you to make a moral choice. And moral choices are hard. Easier to just follow orders. Just keep saluting. Just keep pretending you were professional soldiers serving your country." Von Rothenburg's voice shook as he spoke. "We are not responsible for the actions of the SS. The Wehrmacht was a separate organization. We fought a military war." Patton's laugh was bitter and without humor. "Separate? Your armies rounded up civilians and turned them over to the SS. Your logistics networks transported prisoners to camps. Your officers cooperated with Einsatzgruppen killing squads. You want to draw a distinction between Wehrmacht and SS? Fine. One group operated the death camps, and the other group made it possible for them to operate. You're arguing about degrees of complicity in genocide." The photographs continued to circulate, and now some of the officers were openly weeping. One elderly general, a man who had served in the German military since World War I, collapsed to his knees on the pavement, his body shaking with sobs. "I didn't know," he kept repeating. "I didn't know it was this bad." Patton looked down at him without sympathy. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." He turned to address all of them again. "Here's your choice, gentlemen. Right now, in this moment, you can continue to salute the memory of Adolf Hitler. You can cling to your oath to a dead dictator and to the ideology that produced these photographs. If you make that choice, you will be classified as unrepentant Nazis, and you will be treated accordingly. Maximum security detention, war crimes investigations, the full weight of Allied justice. Or," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "you can acknowledge reality. You can admit that you served an evil regime, that your oath was to a monster, and that Germany's future requires something different than what you've been offering. You can salute that American flag, not because you love America, but because you're finally brave enough to acknowledge that you lost, that you were wrong, and that the world you believed in deserves to die." The silence in that courtyard was absolute. 41 men in their underwear, stripped of their military identity, forced to confront photographs of atrocities committed under the flag they had just saluted, now faced with a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Von Rothenburg stood there, his aristocratic bearing completely shattered, his carefully maintained self-image of the professional soldier crumbling around him. Finally, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "If we salute your flag, what happens to us?" Patton's response was immediate. "You'll be processed as cooperative prisoners. You'll be interviewed about military operations for historical record. You'll likely be released within a few months to help rebuild Germany under Allied supervision. You'll go home to whatever's left of your families and your lives. But you'll do it as men who had the courage to face the truth, even when it destroyed everything you believed about yourselves." He gestured to the 12 officers still in uniform, the ones who had saluted the American flag from the beginning. "These men understood something you didn't. Surrendering isn't just about laying down weapons. It's about laying down the beliefs that made you pick up those weapons in the first place. It's about having the strength to admit you were wrong." And then Patton did something that shocked everyone present. He had his MPs bring out 41 American military blankets and ordered them distributed to the shivering officers. "I'm not going to let you freeze to death while you make your decision," he said. "Contrary to what you might have believed, we're not barbarians. We're Americans. And we believe that even men who've made terrible choices deserve a chance to make better ones." What happened next would become one of those moments that defines the moral complexity of war and its aftermath. Wrapped in American military blankets, standing barefoot on cold pavement, stripped of the uniforms that had defined their identities for decades, the 41 Wehrmacht officers faced the hardest decision of their lives. For several long minutes, nobody moved. The psychological weight of what Patton was demanding was enormous. Not just a physical salute, but a complete repudiation of everything they had been, everything they had believed, everything they had sworn to uphold. These were men who had built their entire sense of self around loyalty, duty, and obedience to authority. And now they were being asked to acknowledge that those very virtues, when pledged to the wrong cause, had made them accomplices to unthinkable evil. General von Rothenburg looked at the photographs still scattered on the ground around them. Images of skeletal corpses and crematorium ovens. He looked at his fellow officers, some still defiant, others clearly broken. He looked at the American flag still flying above them, a symbol of the nation that had defeated everything he had fought for. And finally, he looked at Patton, this American general who had just humiliated them in a way that no battlefield defeat ever could, yet who had also offered them something unexpected, a path forward, a chance at redemption, a way to reclaim some fragment of honor from the wreckage of their choices. "General Patton," von Rothenburg said slowly, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. If we do this, it must mean something. It cannot be just a gesture of convenience, a way to avoid punishment. If I am to renounce my oath to the Frere, if I am to acknowledge that I served evil, then I need to understand what I am pledging myself to instead." Patton nodded, and for the first time since the ceremony began, his expression softened slightly. "That's the first intelligent thing you've said today, General. You're right. This can't be just a strategic move to save your own skin. That would be meaningless." He walked closer to von Rothenburg, speaking now in a tone that the other officers had to strain to hear. "Here's what you'd be pledging yourself to. Not to America. We don't need your loyalty and frankly wouldn't trust it anyway. Not to the Allied powers or to some new political system. What you'd be pledging yourself to is simpler and harder than that. You'd be pledging yourself to the truth, to face what was done, to help ensure it never happens again, to rebuild Germany not as it was but as it should have been, to teach the next generation of Germans that loyalty without moral judgment is not a virtue. It's a weapon that can be turned to any purpose, noble or monstrous." Von Rothenburg absorbed this, then asked the question that was clearly tearing at him. "And our honor as soldiers? Our service to Germany? Does all of that become meaningless?" Patton's answer was not unkind, but it was unflinching. "Your honor as soldiers was destroyed the moment you continued serving a regime that operated death camps. I'm sorry if that's harsh, but it's true. You don't get to separate your honorable military service from the regime you were serving. They're inseparable. But," and here Patton paused, choosing his words carefully, "what you do from this moment forward can mean something. Not redemption. You don't get to be redeemed from complicity in this, but perhaps something like responsibility. The responsibility to make sure Germany never follows another Hitler, never pledges itself to another madman, never again mistakes obedience for virtue." The words hung in the air like smoke. And then, slowly, General Klaus von Rothenburg let the American blanket fall from his shoulders. Standing there in his undershirt and shorts, barefoot and stripped of all military pretense, he came to attention. His arm rose, not in the stiff Nazi salute he had given minutes earlier, but in a proper military salute, the kind that soldiers have rendered to flags and commanders for centuries. His eyes fixed on the American flag, and in a clear voice he said, "I salute the flag of the United States Army, and I acknowledge the authority of the Allied powers over Germany." My oath to Adolf Hitler is renounced. I will cooperate fully with American forces." For a moment, he stood there alone in his salute, vulnerable and exposed. Then, one by one, other officers followed. An older colonel, tears streaming down his face, raised his salute. A major who had been part of the Wehrmacht since before the war began. A captain barely 30 years old who had known nothing but Nazi rule. Within 5 minutes, 38 of the 41 officers had rendered their salutes to the American flag. Only 3 remained defiant, 2 younger officers, true believers who would rather die than renounce their Frere, and 1 elderly general who simply stood silent, his face a mask of stone, refusing to either salute or speak. Patton looked at those 3 for a long moment, then nodded to his MPs. "Take those 3 into separate custody. Maximum security. They've made their choice." As the 3 defiant officers were led away, one of them shouting "Sieg Heil." Even as he was dragged from the courtyard, Patton turned his attention back to the 38 who had saluted. "You can put your uniforms back on," he said quietly. "But understand this, those uniforms don't mean what they meant an hour ago. You're not Wehrmacht officers anymore. That organization is dissolved. That army is disbanded, that identity is finished. You're German men who once served in the military, and who now have a choice about what kind of German men you want to be going forward." As the officers dressed, pulling their uniforms back on with hands that still shook, Patton had chairs brought out and ordered his civil affairs officers to begin formal interviews. But before that process started, he did something that surprised everyone present one more time. He walked up to von Rothenburg, now back in uniform but somehow looking smaller than he had before, diminished not in stature but in that aristocratic certainty that had defined him. "General," Patton said, "I need you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't about humiliating you for sport. It wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking through the armor of self-deception that lets intelligent men serve monstrous causes while telling themselves they're just doing their duty." Von Rothenburg met his eyes. "I understand that now, General Patton. Though I confess, the lesson was harsh." "The truth usually is," Patton replied, "especially when you've been running from it for years." He paused, then continued, "I'm going to ask something of you and the others who saluted that flag. In the coming months, Germany is going to be full of former Wehrmacht officers claiming they were just following orders, that they knew nothing about the camps, that they were professional soldiers untainted by Nazi ideology. That lie will be comfortable and convenient, and many will believe it because believing it is easier than facing the truth. I want you to counter that lie. I want you to tell the truth about what it was like to serve Hitler, about the choices you made and didn't make, about how easy it is for good men to serve evil when they convince themselves they're just being loyal soldiers." Von Rothenburg was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're asking us to condemn ourselves, to admit our guilt publicly." "I'm asking you to tell the truth," Patton corrected. "Whether that's self-condemnation or just honest accounting, I'll let you decide. But Germany's future depends on it facing its past honestly, and that has to start with men like you having the courage to admit what you were part of." What happened in the months following that confrontation in the courtyard became part of the complicated, messy process of denazification. Von Rothenburg and several of the other officers who had saluted the American flag that day did indeed become some of the first German voices to speak honestly about Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi atrocities. They gave testimony at trials. They wrote accounts of their service that didn't hide behind the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. They worked with Allied authorities to identify war criminals and uncover hidden Nazi networks. Not all of them. Some reverted to the comfortable lies once American attention moved elsewhere. But enough of them held to that moment in the courtyard, that choice they had made while standing in their underwear with American blankets around their shoulders, forced to choose between comfortable delusion and uncomfortable truth. And Patton's reputation among the German officer corps became something complex and contradictory. They feared him certainly. Many hated him for what he had done that day, for the humiliation he had inflicted. But some, including von Rothenburg himself, who would later write a memoir about his experiences, came to respect him in a way they respected few other Allied commanders. Because Patton had done something remarkable, he had refused to let them hide behind their uniforms and their claims of professional military honor. He had stripped away the costume and forced them to confront what they had actually been. Not noble warriors, but servants of evil who had confused loyalty with morality. The story of what happened in that courtyard spread quickly through German military circles and beyond. Different versions emerged, some exaggerated, some sanitized, but the core truth remained. Patton had faced down Nazi defiance not with violence but with psychological warfare more devastating than any battle. He had understood that defeating Germany wasn't just about destroying its armies, it was about destroying the myths that had allowed those armies to serve Hitler in the first place. And perhaps most importantly, he had offered a path forward, harsh and humiliating as it was, that recognized something that many Allied commanders missed: that the German people, including former Wehrmacht officers, would have to live with their choices for the rest of their lives, and that Germany's future depended on whether they chose comfortable lies or difficult truths. The 12 officers who had saluted the American flag from the beginning, who had never rendered the Nazi salute, were quietly commended and released within weeks. Several of them went on to serve in the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new military, when it was formed in 1955. The lesson was clear. There was a future for German military men who could separate professional service from ideological fanaticism, who could serve their country without serving a dictator. But that future required acknowledging what had gone wrong, why it had gone wrong, and accepting that just following orders was not an excuse but an admission of moral failure. This is the story they don't always tell you about the occupation of Germany, not the simple narrative of good versus evil, victor versus defeated, but the complex moral reckoning that had to happen before Germany could begin to rebuild. Patton understood something that day in that courtyard, that winning the peace required not just defeating Germany's armies, but defeating the psychology that had made those armies willing servants of genocide. And he was willing to do whatever it took, even if it meant humiliating proud officers and forcing them to face truths they had spent years avoiding, to ensure that the defeat was not just military but moral, not just physical but psychological. If this story gave you a new perspective on World War II, on what occupation really meant, on the moral complexity of how you handle defeated enemies who still cling to defeated ideologies, then we need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're bringing you these untold stories every week. The moments of moral decision, psychological warfare, and human drama that standard history books skip over. Smash that like button if this story moved you or made you think. And most importantly, drop a comment below with your honest reaction. Did Patton go too far? Or was this exactly what Nazi defiance deserved? Would you have made the same choice in his position? We want to hear your thoughts, your debates, your perspectives from around the world. Share this video with someone who loves history, because stories like this, complicated, uncomfortable, deeply human stories, are the ones that help us understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another untold moment from history that will challenge everything you thought you knew.